Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook coming back to you again for Modern American History, which in this course we define as U.S. history after 1877. So we will not be getting into the Civil War or the Reconstruction period. Actually, we're beginning with the Gilded Age, with capital and labor, with the westward expansion, and today we're going to talk about the rise of the American Empire and American expansion into the globe. So, without further ado, by the way, I'm recording this in Maryland, in the beautiful town of Columbia, Maryland, in the summer of 2024. I'm up here with my wife. I'll be back in Miami by the end of August, and we'll hopefully see you in the classroom this fall. So, let's jump right in to the American Empire. This is Chapter 19 of the American Yop, an emerging world power from 1877 through 1914. This is our time period today, and I got to fumble around a little bit with my technology here. Here is a rather racist cartoon from the period of the Spanish-American War. Shortly after, you see Uncle Sam looking like a stern schoolmaster trying to educate a group of little boys of color. And if you can look closely at the pictures of these unruly little boys, you'll see they're representing Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and what's the last one? The Philippines. And he's having a hard time maintaining order. If you look a little further, you'll see over in the corner beside the door, you'll see a caricature of a Native American, also doing some reading and studying. A child of color standing outside looking in, and over by the window you see an African American washing the windows. This is not long after the Civil War. A lot of people that were slaves are now newly freed. So this is quite a racist depiction of Uncle Sam trying to teach democracy to these peoples of color who the assumption is had substandard cultures or societies. So moving right along, here is the timeline. I'll just point out a few things, a few important things. Hawaii came within the U.S. orbit in 1875. The United States achieved a favorable balance of trade. James G. Blaine inaugurated the concept of Pan-Americanism. There's a lot I could say about that I teach in Latin American studies. There was a conflict in Samoa with Germany. And then Alfred Thayer Mahon wrote a significant book for our history purposes called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1890. This was a key book that influenced the thinking of a number of the political elites of the United States about the future of the United States, particularly a young Theodore Roosevelt, who read this and later became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And, of course, his premise was that every great empire had to have a navy, a global navy. And he goes throughout the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Roman Empire, which was forced to improvise and build a navy in the Mediterranean in order to defeat Carthage. And he shows that a global navy is essential to project power globally as an empire. And this leads to the obvious question, then what do you need to have a global navy? Well, you need sea ships in both hemispheres. You need them in the Atlantic. You need them in the Pacific. They need to have a way to cross from one ocean to the other. And they need logistics. They need some place to refuel and restock. In other words, they need naval bases. So the question then becomes, where would be key points on the globe to establish naval bases? And as you look at the period of time with beginning with Hawaii And then later with the Spanish-American War, with the conquest of the Philippines, Manila Bay, Subic Bay, Puerto Rico, Cuba, you see the beginnings of naval bases. One in Cuba, one in the Philippines, one in Hawaii, and these become stepping stones to an American global empire, influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahon's important book. Also, there was an attempt to annex Hawaii to the United States after a group of businessmen illegally overthrow the Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. They overthrow her and they established a temporary state, a temporary Republic of Hawaii. And then they applied to the United States for annexation, which failed in 1893 because I believe Grover Cleveland had become president and he was anti-imperialist. By the way, Bill Clinton in 1994, when he became president, apologized to Hawaii for overthrowing their government and somewhat forcibly bringing them into the United States. Of course, we ended up with Pearl Harbor, or the global design to develop sea bases around the world. But Bill Clinton did recognize that error of imperialism and apologize for it. I respect him for that. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote an important thesis called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And so as the U.S. spread across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific and eventually took possession of California in the 1840s, the frontier closed. There was no longer really a frontier in the United States, and of course the idea then is that the United States must then begin to expand beyond its continental borders into new frontiers. Venezuela crisis, that was an important step in the relationship between the United States and Latin America, and also the British were involved. The United States stepped in and arbitrated a conflict between Great Britain, I believe it was, and Venezuela. The Cuban Civil War began in 1895 with the inspiration and the writings of Jose Marti. This was their second attempt to gain their independence from Spain. The United States, it ended up becoming basically a stalemate with very brutal tactics by the Spanish to keep the Cubans in subjection. Several years go by, Jose Marti was killed, became a martyr, but then the war drums began beating in the United States in what is called yellow journalism, which still exists with us today, which is when the media begins to beat the war drums and try to prepare the public and manufacture a consensus to support military ventures. This happened in 1898 with William Randolph Hearst in New York, and it drummed up sympathy for the poor Cubans who were being outgunned and outmanned and abused by the Spanish, whipping up sympathy for the United States to go to war in Spain. There was also an anti-imperialist movement that was launched. As I mentioned earlier, I believe Grover Cleveland was one president who was anti-imperialist. You might put down Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens in that category. The Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War in 1899, with the United States getting the spoils of war, taking possession of the Philippines, of Guam, of Puerto Rico, and gaining a sphere of influence in Cuba. This then opens a second war, the War of the United States in the Philippines, when the Filipino patriots turn their weapons against the U.S. Marines and continue fighting for their independence and their freedom against the United States, who's now their colonial overlord. Theodore Roosevelt unexpectedly becomes president in the United States in 1901 when William McKinley is shot and assassinated. And he begins his presidency with the idea of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, which he certainly carried the big stick. We'll talk about that. In 1902, the United States withdrew from Cuba, but left the Platt Amendment in place, giving the United States the right to intervene anytime it wanted to. So, in other words, Cuba really wasn't free. 1903, the United States recognized Panama and received a grant of the Canal Zone. This is quite a story, and check the time here. This is quite a story. I didn't learn about this in school in the United States in history class. I learned about it in Colombia, in a Colombian university, Los Andes University, in Colombian history, and I was the oldest student in the class, kind of a midlife special student in my 30s. And we got to 1902, and the young professor pointed out that Panama had belonged to Colombia. It was one of the states of Colombia, which I had no idea. And that Teddy Roosevelt El Malo, had fomented a rebellion in Panama, manufactured a rebellion in Panama, in order to rip it away from Colombia, its rightful owner, and create a new country that would be a client state of the United States and allow the United States to have the access to the Canal Zone. I didn't know any of that until I was in my mid-30s and I was taking history in a Colombian classroom. It was awkward, to say the least. And then Roosevelt comes up with the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine stated that no European countries would be allowed to interfere in the American hemisphere. The Monroe Corollary basically says if there is a dispute between a European nation and an American nation, the United States would mediate. And that began shortly after. Several incidents. There was a agreement with Japan. Intervention in the Mexican Revolution. I could talk at length about that. It's one of my favorite episodes, where Woodrow Wilson intervenes in Mexico. Well, actually, before that it was Robert Taft in 1913, but then after 1914 it's Woodrow Wilson who intervenes in Mexico, sends an expeditionary force of 120,000 soldiers into northern Mexico to apprehend or kill Pancho Villa, and that only comes to an end just as the involvement of the United States in World War I is beginning. So that takes us up to the end of our period of time. Let me go on to the next one. Here is a picture of Cubans hard at work cutting sugar cane. This period of time, there were Asians from China, Japan, and Korea, and the Philippines who came to work and to replace some of the slave labor that became emancipated as a result of the independence of Cuba. And very hard. These are Japanese workers here. It was very hard, physically grueling labor. One journalist said, I guess it was a song by the Japanese laborers, but when I came, what I saw was hell. The boss was Satan. The average life expectancy of Africans who were brought forcibly to work in Cuba on the sugar plantations was about 7 years. And it was cheaper to work them to death than it was to try and help them reproduce themselves and families. So here's an example of or an illustration of the exports and imports in the United States. From 1870 through 1914, you see that the exports were climbing rapidly. Imports were basically tracking along with them. But at some point around 1890, 1895, the exports began to dip in 1895, and I'm sorry, let me get it right. Imports. There they are. Imports in 1890 were higher than the exports, which is a bad balance of trade. It means you're importing and paying for more that you're bringing into the country than you're sending out. So the United States political elites and economic elites decided that they needed to get some new markets where they could sell more of their products to other countries. Hence, this was the roots of expansion. And this was what led to the thinking that we need a global navy, we need global projection, we need an American empire so that we can sell stuff to China, to Japan, to South America. Of course, the United States has shown its military strength during the Civil War. Many European powers came to observe the Civil War. The Germans actually used a lot of the U.S. Civil War strategy on the French in 1870. During the Civil War, the French fielded an army in Mexico and tried to set up a monarchy based on French presence there, and the United States was distracted with the Civil War. But after the Civil War, the United States forcibly responded and demanded that the French remove their troops, which they did, which led to the apprehension and execution of Maximilian. So during the time prior to 1890, which is referred to the Gilded Age, there was a lapse of diplomatic activity in the United States. There was not much of a clear guiding foreign policy during the Gilded Age. This would be like 1877 through 1890. The oceans kept the world at a safe distance. There did not seem to be any reason to maintain a large navy, at least until the unfavorable balance of foreign trade came along. President Chester A. Arthur attempted some modest upgrading of the Navy, but there was not much effort put into this upgrading. President Grant, right after the Civil War, attempted to purchase Santo Domingo, that is the modern Dominican Republic, in 1870. Actually, they requested to be purchased. They were nervous that they would be recolonized by the Spanish. But for one reason or another, it didn't really work out. This idea of purchasing the Dominican Republic and making it an additional state in the United States. And so this was this diplomacy in the Gilded Age was characterized by a lack of clear purpose, largely stumbling from one incident to the next. And in Latin America, I already mentioned James G. Blaine's attempt to involve the United States in Latin American affairs through his concept of Pan-Americanism. It was not very popular because it was rightly perceived as an attempt for the United States to dominate affairs in Latin America. He got involved in a border dispute between Mexico and Guatemala. He tried to settle a war between Chile and Peru, and he called for a conference, a Pan-American conference, which was later canceled by his successor. Nevertheless, the idea of a Pan-American community of states took root. Blaine returned for a second stint in 1889. His efforts were soon undone by the U.S. reaction to a riot against American sailors in Valparaiso, Chile in 1891. The U.S. threatened Chile with war and forced Chile to apologize and pay $75,000. And this takes us down. I already talked about the revolt against Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. The legitimate ruler of Hawaii was undermined and overthrown by a group of American businessmen who were hoping to bring Hawaii into the United States as an additional state, and hoping that they would be able to build a naval base in Pearl Harbor as a halfway step across the Pacific Ocean, all of which was actually granted. So this was a period of time when the United States around 1890 began seeing the need for economic expansion, for new markets in order to sell stuff. 1/5 of the nation's agricultural output was being exported Between 1880 and 1900, the industrial share of exports jumped from 15 to 30%. 1868, the Singer Sewing Machine Company established its first factory internationally in Glasgow, Scotland. Kodak sold cameras. McCormick sold agricultural equipment. Ford became a household word for selling cars all around the world. As a developing economy, the U.S. attracted a lot of foreign capital. In order to balance, the U.S. needed to export more than it imported. So, European imperialism ticked upwards in 1884 at a conference in Berlin in which the European powers met to carve up Africa into spheres of influence. Pretty cold and cynical. And that was fairly late. That was 1884. That's near the end of the 19th century. Japan transformed itself into a major modern power, partly in order to protect itself from being carved up and taken over by European influence. The Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1894. Japan's easy victory started a scramble among the great powers, including Russia, to divide up China into spheres of influence. I guarantee you that has not been forgotten in China. Probably fuels a good bit of their drive to compete with the West. Now, I've already mentioned in 1890 Captain Alfred T. Mahon's book, The Influence of Sea Power in History. So I won't go back over that. This is the problem of working off two computers, is I'm jumping back and forth. So there were several ideas for a canal. There was one proposal to dig a canal across the Yucatan Peninsula. I think it was the shortest, only 124 miles. There was another one to build a canal through Nicaragua. Cornelius Vanderbilt, if I remember right, was very involved in that. He operated ships, small boats, up and down the Nicaragua River, and that would carry people up to Lake Managua, in which they would cross the lake and then have a short buggy ride to the Pacific coast, where they could pick up a ship to go to California. So the preferred route before the construction of the Panama Canal was through Nicaragua, because of the river and the lake. And there was plans going forward to build that canal in Nicaragua. And then later we'll see how Theodore Roosevelt became involved, and the French had gone bankrupt trying to build a canal across the Panama, probably the unhealthiest option. And we ended up picking up their bankrupt lease and finishing the job for the French in Panama. That's another story. And so it was President Grover Cleveland who canceled the scheme to annex Hawaii when he was elected president because of his convictions against imperialism. But when William McKinley was elected in 1894, I believe it was, that scheme was picked up again, and Hawaii was successfully annexed to the United States. I may have too much information here. So the ideology of expansionism took shape. There was some elements of social Darwinism in the ideology. The idea of the struggle to advance and expand, and that success, survival depended upon the survival of the fittest. Brooke Adams wrote The Law of Civilization and Decay in 1895, saying not to advance is to recede. The U.S. had no choice, according to this argument, but to survive it must expand. That was the argument. And then the idea of the manifest destiny. I don't see the year here, but John Fiske wrote an essay about manifest destiny. I believe this was early in the 19th century. talking about it was the destiny of Anglo-Saxon peoples in North America to expand from the East Coast and the colonies across the Allegheny Mountains, and across the Mississippi and across the Great Plains, over the Rockies and to the western coast along California. This was called Manifest Destiny. And there's a famous painting of the spirit of democracy accompanying pioneers across to the west. Then Theodore Roosevelt wrote an essay called The Winning of the West in 1896, which justified the assault upon Native Americans as a necessary step in the advance of civilization. If you're a Theodore Roosevelt fan, this chapter might be a little bit disturbing for you. As I said, in the classroom in Columbia, they talked about Roosevelt el Bueno and Roosevelt el Malo. So, I've already mentioned Frederick Jackson Turner's The Significance of the Frontier in American History. This was around the time of the end of the westward movement of the population, which was had a psychological impact upon the U.S. Public. Turner suggested a link between the closing of the frontier and overseas expansion. The United States was eager to step onto the world stage. It needed only the right occasion. Let's see here. Here's a picture of Uncle Sam in a cartoon on his way to the Philippines, loaded for construction and with some weapons. On his way, stepping across the Pacific with the Philippines as a stepping stone to get to China, which excitedly awaits Sam's arrival. And the crisis boiled over in 1897. Now we're back to talking about the Spanish-American War. So the New York press was whipping up enthusiasm, sympathy for the Cubans, bitterness towards the Spaniards. I mean, it wasn't entirely untrue, but as usual, it was biased. The media often does this. And whipping up enthusiasm for a war, a just war, to defend the poor Cuban people against their Spanish oppressors. The U.S. demanded that Spain end the war. Spain's conservative regime fell, and General Valeriano Weyler was recalled to Spain. He was considered to be the butcher. He was the one that came up with the idea of reconcentrados. These were concentration camps first used by the Spanish in Cuba, where Cuban peasants and the rural population of Cuba was moved into these campos de concentración, concentration camps, so that they would not be able to supply the insurrectionists, and so they were called reconcentrados. 1898, Spanish loyalists in Havana rioted and offered against an offer of autonomy. The rebels demanded full independence. That was January 1898. Now this war has been going on for 3 years, and the Cubans had already tried to throw off the Spanish domination in 1868 in what was appropriately called the 10 Years' War, because the war lasted 10 years and failed. 1868 to 1878. Now this is 20 years later. Yes, 20 years later. Jose Marti is no longer 17. He's now a young man of 37. And the war is going on since 1895. The Hearst Journal publishes demeaning words by Spanish ambassador regarding McKinley. And then remember the Maine and the hell of Spain. January 1898, the Maine entered Havana Harbor on a courtesy call, and on February 15th, there was a mysterious blast sent the U.S. battlecruiser to the bottom. I don't think it says here, but I think over 200 sailors died in this tragic accident. No one has ever been able to find any evidence that it was anything other than an accident. Perhaps a sailor flicked a cigarette where he shouldn't have, and the ship blew up, but it was blamed on Spain. So the President McKinley cabled Madrid an ultimatum, and the Spanish was desperate, but felt like it could not possibly give in to these demands. I see it here. I have 260 seamen died. That's a pretty big tragedy for the United States in that period of time. McKinley himself assumed that it had been an accident, but he sent an ultimatum to Madrid, and they were unwilling to respond, and so he asked Congress for authority to declare war on Spain. Those were the old days when presidents actually followed the Constitution and would request permission of Congress before they would declare a war. And so the Warhawks in Congress chafed under McKinley's measured progress, but gave congressional approval. Henry Teller of Colorado offered an amendment disclaiming any intention by the U.S. to take possession of Cuba. In other words, to annex Cuba into the United States. Now, that's important. Teller did not propose the same disclaimer about Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Philippines. Only Cuba. Well, why Cuba? Because the press had been beating the drums of democracy and freedom for Cuba. So how could the United States go to war to give Cubans democracy and freedom and then take it away from them by annexing them to the United States? So that put the United States in a bit of an awkward position vis-a-vis Cuba. And McKinley generally did not have expansionist motivations for going to war with Spain, but once the war came, he felt like it was an opportunity that had presented itself and could not be ignored. So the war began. Cuba, enter Theodore Roosevelt. It just so happened that Teddy, which he did not like the nickname Teddy, by the way, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had read, some years earlier, he read Alfred T. Mahon's book on the role of sea power in history. He was up to speed with this idea of an American empire, and he happened to be in Washington in the offices of the Navy when the Secretary of the Navy was out of town for health reasons. And so Roosevelt quickly sent a telegram to the Philippines, commanding the admiral, whose name escapes me at the moment, it'll come back, to proceed with all due haste to Manila Bay and to take the Spanish Navy by surprise. So they were steaming into Manila Bay and defeating the Spanish Navy almost before the ink was dry on the declaration of war. Then Roosevelt called for the raising troops out west and also in the east, a volunteer cavalry that he called the Rough Riders. It was basically his idea. They raised 200,000 civilians and hastily trained them. There's a movie about this. It's entertaining. It's a kind of a grade B made-for-TV movie, but it's worth watching if you want to get some background. It's very pro-American. The Cubans are completely ignored. At this time, the regular army was only 28,000 troops. A very weak regular army. So the 200,000 additional civilians that were quickly trained and groups such as the Rough Riders became very important in this conflict. So in the movie, you see there's some fairly good acting. Tom Berenger plays Theodore Roosevelt. I think he does a pretty good job of portraying Roosevelt's hyper-kinetic personality. Very extroverted, very energetic. And so they gather up a number of volunteers from the West, from New York City, from the South, and quickly train them, move them to Tampa, Florida, where they're moved by ship to Cuba. And the Rough Riders, under the command of Theodore Roosevelt, attacks up one side of San Juan Hill. A African American troop of soldiers under the command of Black Jack Pershing, at that time a Major General John, or not General, but Major John Pershing, attacks up the other side of the hill, and they take the Spanish outpost with some loss of life. And the Cubans are given very little credit in the film. But there's an interesting scene just after the fighting and the shooting stops, where Tom Berenger, playing Theodore Roosevelt, sits down and looks shaken and sobered about what had just happened. It was his first and probably only actual battle in war. And as he's sitting there, obviously moved by the moment, you see behind him there's a tall water tower, and some soldiers are raising the American flag. And someone like Iwo Jima or other scenes of other wars, they raise the American flag, and so it's flapping in the breeze in front of the water tower. And on the water tower are the letters Empire. And apparently it's the Empire Sugar Production Company or Sugar Cane Company. But you see the American flag flapping, and you see the word Empire, and one of the black soldiers comes up to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and says, "It's okay, Colonel, we're fine, we won the battle." And Theodore Roosevelt turns and says, "But it's never going to be the same." And so to me, that's the takeaway shot of that film. It shows this critical moment with Theodore Roosevelt, the American flag, and empire. And the United States turns the corner from being a third world country, a second-rate economic power, and heads into the 20th century on its way to becoming a global, dominant global empire. So, I'm going to stop there, and I'll pick it up. Perhaps I'll be able to pull up a scene from that film for my next video, part 2. This particular chapter is just too long for me to try to get through in one recording, so I'll do a part 2 tomorrow. Okay, thank you. American history, we're turning the corner now in 1900, going from 19th century into the 20th century, and from the U.S. is one more country in the Americas to becoming a dominant world empire. Thank you very much.